The wind on the high plains was a merciless thing, a sculptor of sorrows that carved the lines of a lonely existence onto Alara's face. For 5 years since the fever had taken her John, the silence in their small cabin had grown from a quiet ache into a deafening roar, a constant companion that echoed the emptiness the town doctor had so cruelly confirmed. Barren. The word was a brand upon her soul, a judgment passed not by God, but by the whispers of women in the general store, by the pitying glances of men who saw her not as a widow, but as a failure of nature. Her home, once filled with the hopeful timbre of John's voice planning a future with children's laughter, was now a tomb of memory. The small rocking chair he had carved for a child that would never be sat in the corner, a silent, wooden testament to a dead dream. Each morning she rose from a cold bed and looked out upon the vast, indifferent expanse of land that was fertile and forgiving, unlike her own body. The earth gave back what you put into it, but she felt she had nothing left to give. Her heart was a frozen patch of winter soil, her spirit a flickering candle flame fighting against a blizzard that had no end. She was a ghost in her own life, a vessel of grief adrift on an ocean of prairie grass, waiting for the inevitable tide to pull her under. That evening, as a storm of biblical fury clawed at the roof and rattled the windows, she wrapped a threadbare shawl around her shoulders and stared into the dying embers of the fire, seeing only the reflection of her own exhaustion. Hope was a luxury for other people, a currency she no longer possessed. She had prayed until her knees were raw and her throat was hoarse, but the heavens, like her womb, remained stubbornly empty and silent. This, she thought with a finality that felt like stone, was the end of her story. A quiet, lonely fade into the dust from which she came. Have you ever felt a loneliness so profound that the silence itself becomes a physical weight upon your chest? Have you ever believed that your chapter in the book of life was finished, with no more pages left to turn? This is the story of Alara, a woman who had accepted the end, a widow convinced her purpose was dust. It is a story that proves that sometimes, when we are at our most broken, when the storm is at its loudest, the knock we hear on the door is not the end, but the beginning of a miracle we never dared to ask for. It is the story of how a home thought to be eternally empty was about to become the most important place in the world, a sanctuary for a love so unexpected it would have to rewrite the very definition of faith, family, and forever. Stay with us, and witness the tale of the infertile widow and the 14 souls who came asking for shelter. The knock, when it came, was not a polite rap but a frantic, desperate pounding that seemed to be in a battle with the screaming wind. It was a sound of sheer panic, a fist against fate, and it sent a jolt of pure terror through Alara's heart. No one traveled in a storm like this. No sane person would be out on the plains with the sky tearing itself apart. Her first instinct, born of 5 years of solitude and vulnerability, was to retreat, to press herself into the corner, blow out the lamp, and pretend the world outside, with its violence and its desperation, did not exist. It could be outlaws or a madman lost in the tempest. John had always kept a rifle over the mantel, but she hadn't touched it since his passing, its cold steel a reminder of a protection she no longer had. The pounding came again, louder this time, accompanied by a man's voice, ragged and torn apart by the gale, but carrying a note not of menace, but of pleading. Please, for the love of God, help us. There are children. The word hung in the air, piercing the storm's fury and Alara's fear with surgical precision. Children. The word was a key, turning a lock in her heart that had rusted shut years ago. Against every instinct for self-preservation, she found herself moving toward the door. Her hand trembled as she slid the heavy bolt, the wood groaning in protest. She pulled the door inward, and the storm lunged into the cabin, a savage beast of wind and ice, extinguishing her lamp and plunging the room into the flickering, chaotic light of the hearth. Standing on her doorstep was a figure that seemed carved from the storm itself. A tall, gaunt man in the black, mud-splattered cassock of a priest, his face pale and etched with exhaustion. His eyes, dark and deep-set, held a desperate fire. But it was not him that stole her breath. It was what stood behind him, Huddled together like a flock of terrified sparrows was a shivering group of boys, their faces pinched with cold and fear, their thin coats and threadbare shirts offering no defense against the elemental rage of the blizzard. There were so many of them, their wide, frightened eyes blinking in the firelight. The priest spoke, his voice a raw whisper. "Forgive the intrusion, ma'am. I am Father Thomas. Our church, St. Jude's, the orphanage. It burned. A lightning strike. We lost everything. We have been walking for hours. I saw your light. Please, can you offer us shelter? Just until the storm passes." Alara stood frozen, the cold seeping into her bones, her mind struggling to comprehend the scene. 14 boys, 14 young, shivering lives standing on the threshold of her empty home, led by a man of God whose own faith seemed to be hanging by a thread. The sheer impossibility of it was staggering. Her small cabin could barely hold her and her ghosts. How could it possibly hold 15 more souls? The rational part of her mind screamed at the danger, the impracticality. She had so little food, so little space. But then her eyes fell on the smallest of the boys, no older than 6. His teeth chattering so violently she could hear it over the wind. He wasn't looking at her with fear, but with a sliver of hope so pure and fragile it shattered the last of her hesitation. In that moment he was not a stranger. He was the child she had prayed for, the son she had mourned. They all were. The word barren echoed in her mind, not as a curse, but as a bitter, ridiculous irony. Her home was empty, yes, but her heart, she was discovering, was not. "Get them inside," she said, her voice steadier than she thought possible. "Quickly, before they freeze." And as Father Thomas ushered his precious, shivering flock into the warmth of her home, the storm outside raged on, unaware that within the walls of that tiny, lonely cabin, it had just delivered a miracle. The first few days were a blur of organized chaos, a whirlwind of life that swept through the quiet corners of Alara's home and dusted them with purpose. The silence she had known for 5 years was utterly annihilated, replaced by the shuffling of feet, the murmur of boys' voices, the creak of the floorboards under the weight of a full house. Her small cabin, once an echo chamber for her grief, was now filled to bursting. The boys slept huddled together on pallets she made from every spare blanket and quilt she owned, their bodies arranged like puzzle pieces on the floor before the hearth. During the day, the space was a hive of activity. Alara found herself in constant motion, her hands, so long idle, now perpetually busy. She was mending torn shirts, darning socks, and ladling hot broth into bowls held by hands smudged with ash and grime from the fire. She cooked through her winter stores at an alarming rate, the scent of baking bread and simmering stew, scents she hadn't smelled since John was alive, now filling the air and chasing away the musty smell of sorrow. She had never felt so exhausted, and she had never felt so alive. The boys, once they had thawed from their ordeal, revealed themselves to be a spectrum of boyhood. There was young Leo, the 6-year-old whose hopeful eyes had broken her resolve, who now followed her around like a quiet shadow. There was Peter, the oldest at 16, his face set with a premature seriousness, who tried to help Father Thomas with the bearing of responsibility. There were the mischievous twins, Mark and Matthew, whose whispered jokes sometimes brought a fragile flicker of laughter into the tense air. They were all so different, yet bound together by their shared trauma and their shared dependency on the 2 adults in the room. Father Thomas was an enigma. He moved with a quiet, coiled intensity, his gratitude formal and his posture rigid. He insisted on helping, his large, capable hands, so incongruous with his priestly attire, chopping wood with a grim efficiency that spoke of a man familiar with hard labor. He was a pillar of strength for the boys, leading them in soft prayers in the evening, his voice a low, calming rumble. Yet, when he looked at Alara, his dark eyes were shadowed with a mixture of immense gratitude and a profound, almost sorrowful, distance. He was a man walled off, a protector who kept his own heart heavily guarded. He told her the story of the fire in clipped, precise sentences, his voice devoid of emotion as he described the lightning strike, the rapid spread of the flames through the old, dry wood of the church. He had managed to get all the boys out, but everything else, the records, the books, their few possessions, had turned to ash. They were, he explained, utterly alone. The parish was small, the church their entire world. Now, they were a flock without a shepherd's crook, a family without a home, cast upon the mercy of a stranger. "You are not a stranger," Elara had told him, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "You are a guest in this house." The words felt true as she said them. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a fierce, burgeoning instinct she hadn't known she possessed. It was a maternal fire, banked for years, that now roared to life. When she looked at the boys, she didn't see burdens or mouths to feed. She saw sons. She saw a reason to stoke the fire, to bake the bread, to face the morning. The town's judgment of barren seemed like a whisper from another lifetime. She was not barren. She had simply been waiting for a storm to bring her children home. The fragile peace of their new arrangement was woven in the quiet moments between the chaos. It was found in the shared task of peeling potatoes, in the respectful silence that fell over the room when Elara read aloud from one of John's old books in the evening, the boys' faces wrapped in the firelight. It was in these interludes that the walls between Elara and Father Thomas began to show the faintest of cracks. One evening, after the boys were asleep, their soft breathing a gentle rhythm in the small cabin, the two of them sat at the simple wooden table, a single candle burning between them. The silence was no longer the heavy, suffocating kind Elara had known, but a companionable quiet, filled with unspoken thoughts. "You are a good woman, Elara," Thomas said suddenly, his voice low. He didn't look at her, but stared at his hands, which were resting on the table. They were the hands of a laborer, calloused and strong, not the soft hands of a priest. "You took us in without a second thought. Most would not have." Elara felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so foreign she barely recognized it. "It was the Christian thing to do," she murmured, deflecting the praise. "It was more than that," he insisted, finally lifting his gaze to meet hers. His eyes were deep pools of weariness and something else she couldn't name, a profound sadness. "It was an act of profound grace. A grace I am not sure I deserve to witness." The intensity in his gaze made her heart beat a little faster. "Why would you say that?" she asked softly. He hesitated, the muscles in his jaw working. It was clear that vulnerability was an unfamiliar territory for him. "Before St. Jude's," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "I was assigned to a parish in the east. There was a cholera outbreak. I was young, arrogant. I thought my faith was a shield. I prayed over the sick. I offered sacraments. But I was afraid. I kept my distance. A family, the Millers, they had a daughter, Sarah. She reminded me of, well, she was full of light. She fell ill. Her mother begged me to stay with her, to hold her hand. I was terrified of catching the sickness. I administered the rites and left. She died alone that night." He closed his eyes, the memory of physical pain on his face. "I failed her. I failed God. My cowardice. It has been my penance ever since." When the fire started at the orphanage, all I could see was Sarah's face. I swore I would not fail again. I would not let fear rule me. A tear escaped his closed eyelid and traced a path through the grime on his cheek. Elara's heart ached for him. She saw him then not as a priest, a stoic protector, but as a man wounded and haunted, trying to atone for a past he could not change. Without thinking, she reached across the table and placed her hand over his. His skin was rough, but warm. He flinched at the contact, his eyes flying open, startled. But he did not pull away. "You did not fail these boys, Thomas," she said, her voice firm with a conviction that came from the very core of her being. "You saved them. You are their rock. That is not cowardice. That is redemption." He stared at their hands, his and hers, a small point of connection in the vast, lonely night. For the first time since he had arrived, a measure of the tension seemed to drain from his shoulders. He turned his hand over and gently curled his fingers around hers. It was not a romantic gesture, not yet, but something deeper. an acknowledgement of shared wounds, a silent pact of mutual understanding. In that moment, they were no longer just a widow and a priest. They were two broken souls finding solace in the ruins of their respective lives. The next morning, as Alara was kneading dough, little Leo, who had been watching her with his solemn eyes, walked up to her. He tugged gently on her apron. She looked down, a smile touching her lips. "What is it, Leo?" He looked down at his feet, then back up at her, his expression earnest. "Can I have some more bread, Mama?" The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. Mama, a name she had longed to hear, a title she had mourned more than anything. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sudden. She knelt down, pulling the small boy into a fierce hug, burying her face in his hair. He was real. This was real. The ice that had encased her heart for 5 long years didn't just crack. It shattered into 1,000 pieces. The passing weeks saw the harsh edges of the prairie winter soften into the tentative promise of spring, and with it, a new rhythm of life settled over the small homestead. The initial shock and frantic survival gave way to a semblance of domesticity, a fragile but beautiful routine that felt less like a temporary arrangement and more like the laying of new foundations. The cabin, once a monument to loss, was now a bustling schoolhouse, a chaotic dormitory, a noisy dining hall, and above all, a home. Alara, transformed by the title Leo had bestowed upon her, fully embraced her role. She established lessons in the morning, her clear voice teaching the younger boys their letters using a charred stick on a smoothed piece of wood, while the older ones read from the few books John had left behind. Her quiet strength, once a tool for mere survival, was now a nurturing force, shaping the young minds in her care. She learned the individual personalities of her 14 new sons. Peter's quiet leadership, the twins' irrepressible energy, young Leo's sweet devotion. She was no longer a ghost in her own house. She was its heart, and its beat was strong and steady. Thomas, in turn, underwent his own quiet transformation. He shed the formal distance like a heavy coat, the rigid lines of the priest softening into the more natural posture of a father figure. He organized the boys into work crews, teaching them to repair the fence line that had sagged from winter snows, to clear stones from the small plot of land Alara had never had the strength to cultivate, and to reinforce the cabin against the elements. His sermons were no longer just spoken prayers, but lived actions. He was building, providing, and protecting. His ministry was no longer confined to the abstract realm of Scripture. It was tangible, written in sweat and calloused hands, in the safety and growing confidence of the boys. The unspoken bond between him and Alara deepened with each passing day. It was a romance of shared glances over the heads of the boys, of a comfortable silence as they sat together after a long day, of the simple, profound intimacy of two people working in tandem for a shared purpose. He began to see her not just as a savior, but as a woman of incredible resilience and grace, her spirit as vast and sturdy as the prairie itself. He saw the way the boys adored her, the way her presence had turned this desolate outpost into a haven of warmth and love. The sight stirred something in him, a feeling that was both deeply comforting and profoundly unsettling, for it challenged the very vows he had built his life upon. He started to wonder if God's plan for him was not to rebuild a church of wood and stone, but to nurture this living, breathing church of found souls. The homestead itself seemed to respond to the life it now held. The small patch of land Thomas and the boys had cleared was tilled and planted with the seeds Alara had saved. The cabin felt sturdier, the fire brighter. The rocking chair John had made no longer sat empty. It was now the coveted spot for the evening's storytelling, a symbol not of loss, but of continuity and hope. They were a family, forged not of blood, but of circumstance and choice, an unlikely constellation of stars that had found their orbit around each other in the vast darkness. This isolated world they had built was a sanctuary, a sacred space defended by their shared resolve, a fortress against the sorrows of the past and the uncertainties of the world beyond their fence line. They were happy, a quiet, hard-won happiness that felt as real and precious as the first green shoots pushing their way through the thawing earth. But the prairie, like life, was a place of deceptive peace. It held its own dangers, its own predators who watched from the tall grass, waiting for a sign of weakness. And their fragile, beautiful world was about to be discovered. The intrusion came on a sun-drenched afternoon that smelled of warm earth and new beginnings. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, a dark speck against the brilliant blue sky, growing steadily larger as he approached the homestead. A knot of unease tightened in Alara's stomach. Visitors were rare and rarely a good sign. As the man drew closer, the unease curdled into a cold dread. She recognized him instantly. Silas Croft. He was a man who owned half the county and acted as if he owned the other half, too. His face was fleshy and perpetually flushed, his eyes small and greedy. He had approached John about their land years ago, wanting its access to the creek, but John had flatly refused. Since John's death, Croft had left her alone, likely assuming, as everyone else had, that she would eventually fail, that the prairie would break her, and he could pick up the deed for a pittance. He reined in his expensive horse near the newly repaired fence, his gaze sweeping over the scene with undisguised contempt. He saw the tilled garden, the smoke curling cheerily from the chimney, the laundry line fluttering with small shirts. But what truly drew his sneer were the boys, who had stopped their work to stare at the stranger, and Father Thomas, who had stepped forward from the barn, his sleeves rolled up, a hammer in his hand. "Well, well, Widow Thorne." Croft's voice was slick with false cordiality. "I see you've been busy. Taken in some strays, have you?" Alara felt a flare of anger. She stepped off the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her spine straight. "Mr. Croft, this is Father Thomas, and these are his boys. They are my guests." Croft's eyes flickered to Thomas, dismissing the priest's presence with a wave of his hand. "A priest playing farmer. How quaint. I'm sure you're all one big happy family. But this is a social call with a purpose." He dismounted, his expensive boots sinking into the soft earth as if they were trespassing. "I'm here to renew my offer for your land. I'll be generous, considering your new burdens." He gestured vaguely at the boys. $1,000 for this worthless patch of dirt. More than fair. You can take your charity case and set up somewhere in town. The offer was an insult, a clear attempt to prey on what he perceived as her desperation. Thomas stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Alara. "The lady is not interested in selling her home, Mr. Croft." Croft's eyes narrowed, his mask of civility slipping. "I wasn't speaking to you, preacher. This is between me and the widow." He turned his full, intimidating attention back to Alara. "Don't be a fool, woman. A woman alone with a dozen mouths to feed? You won't last another season. This land will be mine one way or another. The easy way pays you. The hard way, well, the hard way is just so much more unpleasant." His voice was low, laced with a threat as sharp and cold as a winter wind. The happy bubble of their sanctuary had been pierced. The outside world, in all its greed and cruelty, had found them. Peter, the oldest boy, had moved to stand near Thomas, his young face a mask of defiance. The other boys huddled closer to the cabin, their eyes wide with fear. Alara looked at Croft, this tyrant in a fancy coat, who saw her home as dirt, her family as burdens, and her as an obstacle to be removed. The fear she felt was real, a cold serpent coiling in her gut. But something else was there, too. A fire that had been kindled by love and purpose. This was not just a patch of dirt. This was their world. These were not burdens. They were her sons. "This is my home, Mr. Croft," Alara said, her voice shaking but clear. "It is not for sale. Not now, not ever. You should leave." For a moment, Croft looked genuinely surprised by her defiance. Then his face darkened into a mask of pure malice. "A mistake, widow," he spat. "A very foolish mistake." He swung himself back onto his horse, yanking the reins viciously. "You'll regret this." He wheeled the animal around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy silence in his wake. The peace was shattered. The snake had not just entered the garden. He had promised to burn it to the ground. The days that followed Croft's visit were thick with a tension that was almost palpable. The sun seemed less bright, the prairie wind carried a mournful tune, and the laughter of the boys was muted, replaced by watchful eyes and hushed conversations. The sanctuary had been breached, its walls of peace now feeling fragile and thin. Fear was a constant, unwelcome guest at their table. Alara would start at every strange sound, her heart leaping into her throat, while Thomas found himself scanning the horizon constantly, his posture once again coiled with the rigid alertness of a soldier on watch. They knew Croft was not a man of idle threats. He was a patient predator, and he would be back. They held a council of war that night, the two of them sitting at the table while the boys slept, the flickering candlelight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "He will not let this go," Thomas said, his voice a low brimstone rumble. "Men like him see defiance from those they consider weak as a personal insult. He wants to crush us not just to get the land, but to prove he can." "What can we do?" Alara asked, her voice trembling slightly. "We have no deed in a town he owns, no sheriff who will side with us against him. We are alone out here." Thomas reached across the table, his hand covering hers in a gesture that was now familiar, a source of quiet strength. "We are not alone, Alara," he said, his gaze intense. "We have each other, we have our faith, and we will not be broken." His words were a balm to her frayed nerves, but the fear remained. It was in the following days that Alara's transformation, the one that had been building since the boys' arrival, reached its crucible. She was no longer just a nurturer. She became a strategist. The damsel in distress was forging her own armor. She remembered things John had taught her, small tricks of survival on the plains. She and the older boys dug a shallow trench near the barn, a makeshift firebreak. They filled every bucket and barrel with water from the creek. They reinforced the door and the window shutters. Her fear was not gone, but she was channeling it, turning its frantic energy into a cold, clear-headed resolve. She was a mother protecting her young, and it made her formidable. The confrontation came as they knew it would at dusk. 3 riders this time, dark silhouettes against a blood-red sunset. Croft was in the lead, flanked by 2 rough-looking men whose faces were hard and merciless. They carried torches. The intent was sickeningly clear. Thomas met them in the yard, standing before the cabin, his presence as unmovable as a mountain. Peter and 2 of the other older boys stood behind him, armed with pitchforks and axes, their young faces pale but determined. "This is your last chance, widow," Croft bellowed, his voice dripping with venom. "Get out of the house, or we burn it down with you and your whelps inside." It was then that the cabin door opened. Alara stepped out onto the porch, a rifle held steadily in her hands. It was John's rifle, the one she hadn't touched in 5 years. Felt heavy, but right. The woman who had been terrified to even bolt her own door was now facing down 3 armed men. The resilient survivor had found her courage. "You will not set one foot on this property, Silas Croft," she said, her voice ringing out in the twilight, clear and unwavering. "You will not threaten my family. You will not touch my home. Turn around and ride away, or so help me God. The next sound you hear will be this rifle." Croft laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You think you can stop me, you pathetic woman?" He motioned to one of his men. "Light the barn. Let's give them a preview." As the man dismounted and moved toward the barn with his torch, a sharp command cut through the air. "Now!" It was Thomas's voice. In a flash, one of the older boys, hidden in the shadows, pulled a tripwire they had strung between the fence and a post. The man carrying the torch went down hard, the torch flying from his hand and extinguishing in the damp earth. At the same moment, the other henchman, startled, found himself facing Thomas, who moved with a speed and ferocity that was shocking. He disarmed the man with 2 swift, brutal moves, his face a mask of cold fury. This was not a priest. This was a warrior. Croft, enraged and stunned, drew his own pistol, aiming it squarely at Thomas. But he never fired. A loud crack echoed through the yard, and a splinter of wood flew from the pistol grip in Croft's hand. He cried out in pain and shock, dropping the gun. He stared at the porch. Alara stood there, the rifle still shouldered, a thin wisp of smoke curling from its barrel. She had not aimed to kill, but to disarm. Her quiet strength had found its voice, and it was the sound of a gunshot in the defense of everything she loved. The aftermath of the rifle shot hung in the air, a ringing silence that was more profound than the noise it had replaced. Silas Croft stared at his hand, then at the smoking rifle in Alara's steady grip, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. His plan, built on the assumption of her weakness and fear, had crumbled into dust. The second hired man, seeing his boss disarmed and his companions sprawled on the ground, had no stomach for the fight. He scrambled back to his horse and fled into the gathering darkness without a backward glance. The first man, nursing his pride and a twisted ankle, limped after him, leaving Croft utterly alone, surrounded by the family he had tried to destroy. Thomas stood over him, his chest heaving, the righteous fury slowly draining away to be replaced by a cold, hard authority. "Get up," Thomas commanded, his voice low and dangerous. Croft scrambled to his feet, his arrogance shattered, replaced by a sullen, venomous fear. He looked from Thomas's unyielding face to Alara on the porch, a woman he no longer recognized, a woman transformed by a strength he could not comprehend. "This is over, Silas," Alara said, her voice carrying the weight of finality. "You will never come back here. You will never threaten us again. This land is not yours. This family is not yours to break. We are not afraid of you anymore." Her words were not just a warning. They were a declaration of independence, a final severing of the victimhood he had tried to impose upon her. Croft, defeated and humiliated, could only glare. Without his thugs, without the fear he wielded as a weapon, he was just a petty, entitled man. He snatched his dropped pistol from the ground and, without another word, mounted his horse and rode away, a figure of bitter retreat swallowed by the night. He was vanquished, not just by a rifle and a priest's unexpected fury, but by the unbreakable spirit of a family that refused to scatter. As the sound of his horse's hoofbeats faded, a collective breath was released. The tension broke, and the boys, who had watched with a mixture of terror and awe, rushed forward, chattering with relief. Peter clapped Thomas on the shoulder, his face shining with hero worship. Little Leo ran straight to Alara on the porch, wrapping his arms around her legs and burying his face in her skirt. She rested a hand on his head, the heavy weight of the rifle finally feeling like a burden. Her arms trembled as the adrenaline subsided, and she leaned against the porch post for support. Thomas walked over to her, his eyes full of a powerful emotion that transcended gratitude. He gently took the rifle from her hands, his fingers brushing against hers. He looked at her, at the woman who had faced down a tyrant to protect them, and the last of his own walls, the ones he had so carefully constructed around his heart, crumbled into nothing. The vow of celibacy, the formal identity of Father Thomas, the penance for his past failures, it all seemed to belong to another man, another life. His true ministry, his true calling, was standing right in front of him. "Alara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, his use of her name an intimacy in itself. He stopped, searching for words that could possibly contain the magnitude of what he felt. He looked from her face to the boys gathering around them, a chaotic, beautiful, fiercely loyal tribe. "My whole life, I've tried to serve God by separating myself from the world," he whispered, his confession meant for her alone. "But tonight, I see that my salvation, my purpose, it isn't in a church. It's here, with them, with you." His gaze was a vow more powerful than any he had ever taken. It was a promise of devotion, of a shared future. In the smoking aftermath of the battle for their home, love, in its purest and most unexpected form, had declared its victory. A year later, the homestead was almost unrecognizable. The small cabin no longer stood alone, but was now the heart of a larger, rambling structure, with a new wing built from sturdy timber that Thomas and the older boys had felled and milled themselves. It was a house that had grown to fit the size of the family it held. The garden plot was now a sprawling field, green with corn and beans, and a new, larger barn stood proudly where Croft's man had tried to set his torch. The land, which Silas Croft had called a worthless patch of dirt, was now a testament to life, love, and tireless work. Laughter was the most common sound on the Thorne homestead, a constant, joyful music that had long ago chased away the ghosts of silence and sorrow. Inside the expanded kitchen, Alara moved with the easy grace of a woman in her element. The lines of grief on her face had been smoothed away, replaced by the soft glow of happiness. She was no longer the barren widow. She was mama to 14 growing, thriving boys who filled her days with purpose and her heart with a love so vast it astonished her. The rocking chair John had made was in constant use, a place where she read stories, mended scraped knees, and offered comfort. It was no longer a symbol of what was lost, but a cherished link to a past that had, in its own way, led her to this incredible present. Thomas was no longer Father Thomas. He had written to his bishop months ago, a long, honest letter explaining that he had found a different, more profound congregation, a flock that required not a priest, but a father and a husband. He had traded his black cassock for the simple, honest clothes of a farmer and a family man. He and Alara had been married by a traveling minister in the spring, a simple ceremony held in their yard, witnessed by their 14 sons. Their love, born in crisis and forged in the quiet moments of shared duty, was now the bedrock of their world. It was a deep, steady, and nourishing love, as reliable as the turning of the seasons. That evening, they all gathered around the long, hand-hewn table that Thomas had built, a table large enough to seat them all. The boys, their faces scrubbed clean after a day of work and play, bowed their heads as Thomas said grace, his voice not that of a formal priest, but of a grateful man thanking God for the unbelievable gift of his family. As Alara passed a platter of roasted chicken, her eyes met Thomas's across the table. In his gaze, she saw her past, her present, and her future. She saw the storm, the fear, the fight, and the final, beautiful peace. She saw a love that had redeemed them both, a love that had taken two broken, lonely people and made them whole. The woman who once believed her story was over was now living in the happiest chapter she could have ever imagined. Her house was full, her hands were busy, and her heart, once a frozen, barren thing, was overflowing. She was home, surrounded by her sons and the man she loved, a living testament to the truth that the most beautiful families are often the ones we don't expect, the ones we build ourselves from the foundations of hope and the framework of love. Our story began with a woman drowning in silence, a heart frozen by loss, and a home that was nothing more than an empty shell. It began with the belief that some endings are final, that some wounds can never heal, and that the word barren could be a life sentence. But the tale of Alara and Thomas and their 14 boys is a testament to a greater truth. It is a story that proves that family is not always a matter of blood, but a matter of heart. It is woven from the threads of shared struggle, selfless protection, and the radical choice to love those who need it most. Did Alara's body fail to produce a child? Perhaps, but her soul, her spirit, her boundless capacity for love, proved to be more fertile than 1,000 acres of prairie land. She became a mother in the truest sense of the word, not by birth, but by courage and grace. And what of Thomas? A man bound by sacred vows, haunted by past failures, who believed his path was one of solitude and penance. He discovered that God's work is not always found in the quiet solitude of a chapel, but often in the chaotic, demanding, and beautiful mess of a family. His redemption was not found in prayer alone, but in swinging an axe, teaching a boy to read, and standing beside the woman who showed him what true faith in action looked like. Their story reminds us that the greatest miracles are rarely the ones that part the seas or move mountains. They are the quiet miracles that happen in the human heart. The miracle of a door opening in a storm, the miracle of a shared meal, the miracle of a hand reaching out in the dark, the miracle of a broken person choosing to love again. It teaches us that our deepest wounds can become our greatest strengths, and that our loneliest nights are often just the darkness before a spectacular dawn. What do you think? Do you believe that our true purpose can be found in the most unexpected of places? Can a family born of tragedy become stronger than one born of privilege? We have shared the story of Alara and Thomas with you because we believe in the power of hope, the resilience of the human spirit, and the undeniable truth that love, in all its forms, is the most powerful force in the universe. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in the power of second chances and found families, please let us know in the comments below. Your stories and your voices are part of this community. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspirational tales that remind us of the enduring strength of the human heart. Thank you for watching.